birth and death of modern art. So I wanted to define what modern art is. And modern art is the period of art from roughly the 1870s to the 1970s. So it's about a century worth of time. And to me, I think when understanding art history, modern art is really the most pivotal time to understanding the past, the present, and the future. It really is the fundamentals of what is art and what are artists thinking about. And modern art was really characterized by experimentation, by this rejection of kind of like traditional academic rules, and just focusing on kind of like individual expression, and overall trying to answer the question of what is art, which we will get into. And I kind of like to think of modern art as, especially when I explain this to middle schoolers, as you start over here with the Impressionists at the beginning of modern art, and you kind of end over here with Rauschenberg's white paintings. And so everything that happened to get from here to here. To really understand modern art in its context, we have to understand that for most of history that art existed, art had a very clear purpose. It was like almost a form of technology. It had a very clear role and function in society, which were a few things. First, art was used to communicate, right? Like the very first things that we consider art, like cave paintings, art was, people weren't literate. I mean, the art was quite literally how humans communicated with each other. When you look at art history for centuries, you'll notice so much of it is religious art, and that's because art was used as a tool to spread religion. When you think about European history and the church being the most powerful political and just like overall force in history, they needed people to buy into religion and to convert, and art was one of the tools that they used to do that. People weren't literate. They couldn't read Bibles. Art was how they told the stories of the Bible. Also, Bibles weren't really readily available or easy to be distributed, especially before the printing press was invented. And they were also, I kind of think about, I'm sure we've all had that moment if you travel to Europe and you walk into a church that's like awe-inspiring with all of these images, and it always makes me think about the fact that today we see so many images, we're constantly bombarded by images, but a person living in this time didn't see many images. And this might have been one of the only images that they saw, and sort of the awe that inspired. If it inspires us today, you can think about a person living in medieval times or the Renaissance, like the awe that it inspired, and how that was a tool to spread religion and therefore accumulate power. And art was for the rich and powerful. We also take for granted how many photos we have of ourselves today, how easy it is to take a selfie. But before the advent of the camera, having a portrait of yourself was for the rich and powerful, and it was the ultimate status symbol in a way. And then everything changes. And this is the first photograph ever taken. It's titled The View from the Window at Le Gras, created by Joseph, I always say the last name wrong, but I think it's Niepce, between 1826 and 1827. Photography is happening at a time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and rapid industrialization. And this technology really changes everything. I mean, you have the mechanization of the printing press that makes communication suddenly really easy, and you don't need art anymore to communicate. And then more importantly, you have the invention and the widespread use of the camera. If you have this tool that can take something and represent it completely realistically, then what is the purpose of art? What do we need painting for if we can make art images with the camera? And that is the question that modern art grapples with and tries to answer. And this is a quote by Charles Baudelaire, who was a philosopher at the time. He wrote the book on photography, which is a really great book if you're interested in the subject. And he said, if photography is allowed to supplement art in some of its functions, it will soon have supplanted or corrupted it altogether. And I think photography really did corrupt art as it had been known for centuries. And so sort of the first response to photography being introduced to artists is Impressionism. And at the time, photography freed artists from the burden of accurate representation. So if they didn't have to paint something accurately, could they paint with more loose and more fluid brushstrokes because they used colors that weren't realistic, and those were the things that Impressionists like started to experiment with more and more. And in the same hand, photography taught Impressionists that the momentary was worth capturing. Before that, I mean, paintings take an extraordinary amount of effort, and cameras made it a lot easier to capture the view from outside of a window. And that left Impressionists thinking about how these moments were worth capturing as well. When I think of Impressionism, I always think of Monet's haystacks. Monet painted these haystacks outside of his window over and over and over again. I actually don't even know how many times, but this is like just a snippet of them, and he painted them at different times of day. And he was really trying to capture the light in the morning and at night. And it's interesting to think about how at the time, the technology of taking a photo took often hours to produce one single photograph, which is, fun fact, why when you look at photos of people from back in the day, they're never smiling in the photos. It's because it would be really hard to hold your smile for that long. Your face would probably hurt. So this kind of like fleeting light was not really something that photography could capture, and the Impressionists' response to that was to try to capture it. I will say about the Impressionists and about modern art in general, it's so easy for us today to look at this and think like, obviously this is art and this is good art, but at the time this was like very radical, and a lot of people really didn't like this, and they basically said to the Impressionists, like, don't know how to paint, and we're not real artists. And that kind of gives way to Neo-Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and this is kind of taking it just like one step further from Impressionism, and you're getting, you know, bigger brush strokes, you're getting more exaggerated color. I think about, you know, the pointillism, and this, you probably did it in elementary school, where you did something with like a million little dots, just kind of moving further and further away from realism. And then that brings us into Cubism and Futurism. This is Picasso, this is Braque. And they looked at what the Impressionists were doing, and they asked, can we break down form even more? And they took images and they tried to break them down into geometric shapes. So they were breaking down into, you know, triangles and circles and rectangles. And they were really inspired by what was going on at the time, which was industrialization, and they were inspired by speed, by machine, by cities, by the Industrial Revolution, especially futurists. These movements really show how artists were kind of responding to this industrialization, which is a big part of modernism, and how they saw the world in this kind of like fractured way, and they were trying to make sense of it, which I think is something we can all relate to today. I think, you know, we are going through another crazy technological boom. I feel this way like with AI and the way it makes, you know, the world feel kind of disjointed and fractured at times, and they were feeling that same way that we feel today. And this was just continuing the breakdown of the realistic form and moving further and further away from realism. And so then you get to Mondrian and the style. And Mondrian was really, this is Mondrian here, if you don't know. I'm sure you guys have seen it before. I was on the flyer for this event. Mondrian was really responding to this kind of like machine age and this feeling of, you know, being disjointed, and also World War I, which was happening at the time, by using art to seek clarity and balance and like, universal harmony is what he thought he was doing through this. And Mondrian actually moved to Paris at a young age, and he was introduced to the Cubists, and he was introduced to Picasso, and he was introduced to Braque, and he saw the way that they were taking these realistic, you know, images and breaking down the form. And he thought, can I break down the form even more? Can I break it down to its most simplest components, which are just line and primary colors? And that's exactly what he did. He kind of saw this as a utopia, and he thought that abstraction could create peace through breaking it down into this kind of very simplified form. And then you have Dada and Duchamp and the ready-made, and you can't talk about modern art without talking about Duchamp and the ready-made. And I think in contrast to what Mondrian was thinking about, that he was responding to this kind of like chaotic world that he felt he was living in with harmony and peace and unity, Duchamp decided, I'm going to respond to chaos with more chaos. And the Dada artists Dadaism was all about nonsense and absurdity and being confrontational. And Duchamp was kind of the first to, if modernism is all about trying to answer what is art, I think Duchamp really confronts that most directly. And he was the first to ask, what happens if we take away all the components of what we think makes something art, which is traditional skill, beauty, and meaning? Can we have a work of art that requires no skill to create, that is not beautiful, and that has no meaning? And is that still art? That was kind of the thought behind his ready-mades. And it's also important to note the backdrop of what was happening. I think Duchamp and the Dada artists, this was happening around World War I, and they were very like anti-war and anti-establishment and just kind of like anti-logic with what they were doing here. And of course, we really can't talk about the birth and death of modern art without talking about Duchamp's fountain, which I'm sure you have all seen at some point. But for those of you who don't know, Duchamp's fountain was from 1917, and the story behind it is that at the time, a widely popular way to exhibit your art was there would be these like big art exhibitions, and you would submit your art to the exhibition, and the people who sat on the board of these exhibitions would determine like what art was good enough to make it in these exhibitions. And there was, it was called the Society of Independent Artists in New York, and they decided to have the first ever completely open exhibition. And they said that any artist who pays the entry fee can have their work in the show. And Duchamp actually sat on the board of this Society of Independent Artists. So he decided to test if that was actually true or not, and he got Fountain, which is just a urinal, and under the pseudonym of R. Mutt, he submitted the fountain to the exhibition. And he paid the entrance fee, and lo and behold, it was rejected. And this caused a massive uproar in the art world, because Duchamp is really asking, what is art? And can art be something if an artist says it's art? And if an artist picks an ordinary object and says, this is art now, is it? And that was Duchamp's response to the question of modernism, that what is art, and what is art now in this post-industrial age? And this is a famous quote by Duchamp, which is, anything is art if an artist says it is. And I think we see so many remnants of this today. And then that brings us to abstract expressionism. We are moving right along in modernism. And the abstract expressionists, if all of the artists that we talked about before are sort of responding to this question of what is art by saying art can be just form and art can be anything you say it is, abstract expressionists started to ask, can art be about process, and can art be about feeling, and can art be about the human psyche? Like, are these things art in a way? And abstract expressionism is really, when you think of abstract expressionism, you think of gestural, sort of non-representational painting that sort of like emphasize the artist's individual psyche or emotion or their hand, their process in the work. And this new movement came about post-World War II, when the center of the art world moved from Europe to New York City. So it was, in a big way, it was responding to the kind of feeling of hopelessness that happened after World War II, the threat of nuclear war and the people coping with this horrific war that had just happened. And I think a lot of art historians view abstract expressionism as kind of the sort of like last stand of painting as this sort of like powerful, expressive force in modernism, and also kind of like the beginning of its unraveling. It's kind of like the last stint before the death of modern art that we will get to. And to touch on a few abstract expressionists that you've probably seen and heard of, you have Jackson Pollock, the famous splatter paintings, and for Pollock, painting was about process. It was about the act of painting and not as much the finished product that he was creating. And then you have Rothko, who did these large color field paintings. And Rothko was a Holocaust survivor, and his work was really intended to be about emotion and the emotion that the color evoked. They were intended to be like awe-inspiring and spiritual, and to be brought in through the color. And then you have Willem de Kooning, who is kind of known for these sort of like chaotic, gestural brushworks, almost like violent brushworks. And for him, this work was very like visceral. It was about the gesture in creating the painting. And so that brings us to the death of modern art. So to recap everything that we've just gone through, if modern art asks the question, what is art? Through all the artists we've covered, we've already decided the Impressionists said art doesn't have to be realistic, right? Then you have, the Cubists and the Futurists and Mondrian who say art can be about form and color and shape. And you have the abstract expressionists that say art can be about the act of painting itself. And then of course you have Duchamp, who says literally anything the artist says is art. So I asked you guys, what about blank white canvases? Is this art? Yes? Why? Who said yes?
Yes, I said yes.
Okay, and why?
Well, for me it's art because when I see a white canvas, there's an emotion.
That's a good answer.
So what do they say? If the artist says it's art, it's art.
The artist said, yeah. Duchamp says it's art, then it's art.
And then
So that brings us to, I think, what a lot of art historians consider to be the death of modern art, which is Rauschenberg's white paintings. And Rauschenberg took panels, painted them with plain white house paint with a roller, nothing fancy. He said the panels were supposed to reflect dust, shadows, and that, that was the work. And I think, to go from before modernism, art being this, for centuries of art history, art is this like highly adorned, highly representational, very meaningful work. It all had a meaning or a purpose in society. To then, within the 100 years of modernism, end at the white canvas, and to this be considered art. I mean, these are in the MoMA. They are art, and that is just like amazing and really kind of encapsulates why modern art is so pivotal to just art, the past, the present, and the future of art. So I always put this in here because there are so many times, and I'm sure you've experienced this, where you go to a museum, usually a modern art museum, or walking around a modern art section, and you see a work of art, like one of the ones we just talked about, Rauschenberg's white canvas, or you see a Rothko color field, or a Jackson Pollock splatter paint, and you hear, I don't get art. Like, I could have done that myself. Why is this worth millions of dollars? I could have done it, And I hope through this presentation, like, you understand that these works, it's really all about context, because these artists that we covered were the first artists to do this and to say, this is art. And had it not been for them doing it and saying, this is art, had it not been for Duchamp saying, this urinal is art, that would not have opened the doors for what we have today. So where we are today with contemporary art, and contemporary art is a whole other presentation. I mean, contemporary art literally is the art of today that we're living in. Come to Fountainhead, that's how you learn contemporary art. But I don't really think we can even fully understand contemporary art as we live it, Like, it will be interesting to see how art historians reflect back on the art that's created today. But what I can say about modern art versus contemporary art is that if the question that modern artists were asking, which is, what is art? I think we can all agree has been largely resolved. Like, contemporary artists are, for the most part, not trying to determine what is art and what can be art. It feels like we answered that throughout modern artists. And instead, contemporary artists they're asking different questions about, and they're exploring themes about, the human experience, about identity, about the society that we live in, about our ever-changing world, just like the Cubists and the Futurists and we're responding to their ever-changing world, contemporary artists are responding to our ever-changing world. Just they're not trying to answer if this is art anymore. But it is important to note that a lot of contemporary artists are working against the framework that modern artists set before them. And I always, when I talk about this, I like to talk about the famous banana duct taped to the wall, Mauricio Catalan's The Comedian, which I'm sure we've all seen. And I think after this presentation, it's really easy to see that Catalan is clearly referencing Duchamp. And this is already made. If Duchamp was asking what is art and was trying to answer that through his ready-mades, this specific piece, I think Catalan is asking what is art worth? Because instead of taking this banana and putting it in a museum, he put the banana at Art Basel, which is essentially a giant shopping mall for art. And it's continued to go to the highest bidder and, you know, make headlines about the $6 million banana being eaten that I'm sure, you know, we've all seen. And so in this way, if Duchamp's answer to the question of what is art, if his answer is whatever anyone says is art, Catalan's answer to what is art worth is whatever someone's willing to pay for it. Which he's kind of poking fun at the art market and sort of like the absurdity of it all. I mean, it's absurd, just like the Dada artists were absurd. Yeah, I think it's genius too. Yeah, I think it's genius, especially, you know, I mean, I'm a huge Duchamp fan. So yeah, I love Catalan's banana. I think it's hilarious. So I guess I'll end it here. If modern artists asked, what is art? Then contemporary artists ask, I mean, they ask a lot of questions, but they ask, what does art do? And who is art for? And whose voices are missing? There are a lot of voices that were missing from this presentation and from modern art as a whole. And more importantly, how does art help us make sense of the society that we live in today? Which I think is a question the modern artists were also responding to, just in a different way than contemporary artists are responding today. And that was exactly 20 minutes. So I hope you